David, a skilled ambulance driver, finds himself desperately searching for a new job after losing his position. He ends up working as a chauffeur for a wealthy and ruthless businessman, but the treatment he endures soon becomes unbearable. Just when he thinks he's hit rock bottom, he encounters an elderly man in need of help on the street. Little does he know, this act of kindness is about to change his life forever. Don't miss this incredible story. David gripped the steering wheel tightly, his eyes fixed on the road, but his mind was elsewhere. His whole life had been about serving a purpose. Being an ambulance driver wasn't just a job for him, it was about being part of saving lives. Every siren, every emergency, every adrenaline-filled moment was more than just duty, it was a responsibility. But now he was driving a businessman's luxury car. When David heard that the private hospital he worked for was downsizing due to financial troubles, a strange unease settled over him. The hospital was no longer going to be a fully equipped medical center but would continue operating only as a small clinic. That meant many employees would lose their jobs. His contract was about to end, but he had never considered it a problem. He was experienced, good at what he did. Moving to another hospital should have been easy, right? But he was wrong. Losing his job was just the beginning of his real struggle. Trusting in his future, he had bought a new apartment on installment payments a few months ago. Now he had a monthly mortgage to pay, and with each day of unemployment, his financial crisis deepened. At first he was optimistic, he truly believed he'd find another job soon. But most of his applications were either rejected or ignored. A month passed. By then, it wasn't just about patience, it was about desperation. He was no longer picky. It didn't have to be an ambulance job, any driving job would do. He had to survive. His debts, his bills, his worries about the future, they were all weighing on him. And finally he got a response. But this wasn't an ordinary job. The employer was a wealthy businessman named Mr. Wagner. David had never heard anyone speak well of him. Strict, harsh, controlling, intolerant of even the smallest mistake. But the pay was good. And David had no other choice. The first few days were rough. David was used to following orders, but in the emergency service, everything was about teamwork. Here it was different. Mr. Wagner was rude, impatient, and constantly irritated. To him, employees weren't people, they were just tools to keep things running smoothly. In his first week alone, David had been scolded countless times. And for no reason. Traffic congestion? His fault. The rain slowed them down? Still his fault. Wagner was the kind of man who took his stress out on his employees, and it didn't take long for David to realize he was one of his targets. Normally, David would never tolerate this kind of treatment. But this time he had to stay silent. He had to keep this job to pay his mortgage, cover his bills, and simply survive. David opened his eyes at the first light of morning. When he checked the time, he realized he had no time for breakfast. He couldn't be late. Mr. Wagner was obsessed with discipline, and being late could turn even the smallest mistake into a huge issue. Ignoring his hunger, he quickly got ready, grabbed his jacket, and rushed out of the house. As he started the car, he felt a slight pang of hunger in his stomach. It's fine, I'll eat after work, he thought. On top of the stress he had been dealing with for days, now he had to add hunger to the mix. But right now the only thing that mattered was not losing his job. When he arrived at the mansion, he parked in front of the entrance as usual and waited. Minutes passed. There was no sign of Mr. Wagner. Just then, a maid appeared from the mansion. She walked toward David with slow, hesitant steps and spoke in a timid voice. Mr. Wagner's meeting has been delayed by an hour. He asked me to inform you. David sighed and said, "Thank you." There was nothing he could do but wait. The woman was about to turn back when she suddenly hesitated. Her eyes lingered on David's face for a brief moment. "Are you hungry?" she asked kindly. At first, David didn't want to admit it, but his stomach betrayed him. A soft growl broke the silence. Smiling slightly, he said, "Yeah, but it's fine. I'll eat after work." The woman sighed, nodded, and walked back into the mansion. 5 minutes later, she returned, holding a freshly made sandwich, and handed it to David. David was surprised. This small but thoughtful gesture warmed him inside. He thanked her sincerely, took the sandwich, and got back into the car. Before starting the engine, he took his first bite. The cheese inside was much tastier than he had expected. But just then, a sharp tapping sound echoed against the window. David flinched and turned his head. On the other side of the glass, Mr. Wagner's cold, furious eyes were piercing right through him. David's stomach dropped. He had a bad feeling about this. He immediately got out of the car and composed himself. "I was told your meeting was delayed by an hour, sir," he said in a formal tone. Mr. Wagner narrowed his eyes. There was sharp suspicion on his face. "Is that my sandwich?" he asked. David froze. What was he talking about? "I'm sorry, sir? I don't understand." This time Wagner's voice exploded. "Did you take that sandwich from my house?" David stood still. He glanced sideways at the maid standing by the door, looking guilty and terrified. She was clearly afraid Wagner would start yelling at her. David took a deep breath. To protect her, he lied without hesitation. "No, sir." Wagner's eyes narrowed in rage. The moment David spoke, he knew he had made the wrong choice. Wagner didn't believe him. Suddenly, Wagner snatched the sandwich from David's hand and took a big bite. He chewed, swallowed. Then he stepped closer inch by inch. "You must be rich, huh?" His voice was mocking, dripping with sarcasm. "You must have plenty of money to afford cheese specially imported from Anatolia. Liar. Thief." David felt his breath hitch. The maid was trembling in fear. She was clearly dreading the moment Wagner would turn his anger on her. David couldn't stand being humiliated like this over a sandwich. He took a deep breath and stood his ground, locking eyes with Wagner. "I'm sorry, sir, I was hungry and I took it from the kitchen." Wagner's eyes flashed with fury. "You lied to me. You pathetic liar," he shouted. David gritted his teeth. That was it. He couldn't put up with this nonsense any longer. "You can fire me." His voice was calm but defiant. Wagner burst into laughter. "Oh, are you giving me permission?" he sneered. "Get off my property, you lying thief." David hesitated for a second, then turned his gaze to the maid, who stood at the door with tears in her eyes. She swallowed hard and in a choked voice whispered, "I'm sorry." David took a deep breath. Without saying another word, he turned around and walked away. Behind him, Wagner's furious shouts echoed in the air. But David wasn't listening anymore. He had too much pride to sell his dignity. David started walking, his steps fueled by frustration. He had been fired with nothing but a dismissive shout. All because he was hungry. Over a sandwich. Wagner's voice still echoed in his ears, but the anger he had felt was slowly turning into fear. What was he going to do now? He was jobless, drowning in debt. His mortgage payments were still piling up, and the end of the month was coming fast. He needed a new job immediately. But where? He had been waiting for weeks to hear back from a hospital, but nothing. Where else could he even work? Lost in thought, he kept walking, watching as luxury cars passed by one after another. He was in one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the city. He couldn't wrap his head around the unfairness of it all. Some people had more than they could ever need, while others got humiliated just for being hungry. A deep, indescribable rage bubbled inside him. And then, something unexpected happened. Out of nowhere, an old man in pajamas ran out into the street. David couldn't believe his eyes. The man was barefoot, shivering, yet running as if he were terrified. He had no idea where he was going, he was just running aimlessly. David stopped. His heart was racing. He could see the fear in the man's eyes. And then, a luxury car hit the man lightly, forcing it to stop. The road was icy and the driver hadn't been able to brake in time. David sprang into action. He rushed over, carefully helping the man up. His pajamas were covered in mud. He looked shaken and scared. Just then the driver of the car stepped out. A man in an expensive suit, polished, sophisticated, but indifferent. He glanced at the old man before wrinkling his nose in disgust. "What's a homeless guy doing here?" he scoffed. "This is an elite neighborhood." David couldn't believe what he had just heard. He didn't even care if the man was okay. His only concern was that someone like him had tainted his neighborhood. Without another word, the driver got back into his luxury car and drove off like nothing had happened. David swallowed his anger. Right now, the only thing that mattered was making sure the old man was okay. He quickly took off his jacket and wrapped it around the man's shoulders. Kneeling down, he looked him in the eyes and spoke in a calm but firm voice. "You're safe. What happened? Why did you run out like that?" The old man's eyes darted around blankly. It was clear his mind wasn't completely there. I, he mumbled, his voice shaky and lost. His hands trembled, his breathing uneven. David realized the man was on the verge of panic. There was no time to waste. He needed a doctor. Just then a taxi passed by. David raised his hand and shouted, "Hey, taxi. Urgent." The taxi pulled over a few meters ahead. David carefully lifted the old man to his feet, supporting him under his arm, and helped him into the back seat. The driver glanced at them through the rearview mirror, looking surprised. "What happened to him?" David responded quickly. "Take us to the hospital. Now." The driver hesitated for a second but, hearing the urgency in David's voice, stepped on the gas. Inside the car, David kept the old man upright, supporting his head. He had no idea where he had come from or who he was. But there was one thing he knew for sure: if no one helped him, the old man might not make it through the night. As David rushed into the hospital under the bright fluorescent lights, a medical team immediately took the old man and led him into an examination room. The fear on the man's face hadn't faded, his breathing was erratic, and his eyes darted around, suspicious of every movement. The moment the doctors approached him, the man suddenly started thrashing. "You can't take me. I just came from the war. You're the enemy. I'll fight you all." His voice echoed through the hallways. His hands pushed away anyone who got too close, his eyes filled with nothing but terror and fury. David stood frozen at the doorway, stunned. The man had gone into full defense mode like a frightened child. One of the doctors, speaking in a gentle but firm voice, tried to calm him down. "You're safe now. No one is going to hurt you." The man struggled a little longer, his breathing became more erratic, his body tensed. But eventually, exhaustion took over and his resistance faded. The doctors carefully led him into the examination room. David felt his chest tighten. Whatever this man had been through, it had left deep, painful scars. As the automatic glass doors closed, the man's distressed cries still echoed in the hallway. And then, silence. David slowly walked toward the waiting area. His mind was a mess, his hands stuffed in his pockets, his head lowered in thought. Just then the receptionist's phone rang. "Yes, sir, I understand." Yes, an unidentified elderly man was just brought in. "He's currently in the examination room." David lifted his head slightly, listening in. "Yes, of course. Please come to the hospital." As the receptionist hung up, she murmured to herself, "I hope it's his family." David silently thought the same. "I hope so." The thought of the man being all alone, lost in the shadows of his own mind, unsettled him. Who was he? Where had he come from? Did he even have family looking for him? As he waited, the examination room door finally opened, and the doctor stepped out. His face was tired but calm. David immediately stood up. "How is he?" he asked. The doctor took a deep breath, rolling his shoulders slightly. "The man you found has Alzheimer's." David was stunned. This disease sometimes triggers episodes like the one you saw. He gets lost in his own memories, reliving past events as if they're happening right now. For him, that moment was real. His body is here, but his mind is somewhere else. David swallowed the lump forming in his throat. "So, he thought he was back in the war, didn't he?" the doctor continued. David closed his eyes, recalling the fear in the man's voice, the desperation in his cries. This disease left people completely vulnerable. David didn't know who the man was, where he came from, or if there was anyone out there who still loved him. But there was one thing he did know: if this man was alone, if he had been forgotten, then the biggest war he was fighting was inside his own mind. David swallowed hard and looked at the doctor. "I hope his family gets here soon. Is there anything I can do for him?" The doctor nodded. "Actually, yes. He asked for you. But he's exhausted right now, he needs some rest. You can see him later." David nodded, taking a deep breath as he sat back down. There was nothing to do but wait. David took a deep breath and gently pushed the hospital room door open, stepping inside. The old man was sitting up in bed, his eyes calmer now, but there was still a trace of embarrassment in them. As their eyes met, the man lowered his head slightly and muttered in a quiet voice, "I'm sorry." David gave him a warm smile and shook his head. "Oh, sir, there's nothing to apologize for." The old man averted his gaze. "I can't help it." His voice was fragile. David slowly sat on the edge of the bed, placing his hands gently over the old man's. "I know." His voice was soft, reassuring. "But you're safe now. Please just rest." The man's eyes welled up slightly before he took a deep breath. "Because of you, I am." A grateful smile formed on his lips. For a while they sat in silence. David watched as the old man's gaze drifted beyond the hospital walls, lost in thought. At last, the old man furrowed his brows and sighed deeply before speaking. "People like you don't exist in that neighborhood, you know?" David flinched slightly at the comment. His head dipped, lips pressing into a thin line. "I'm sure they do," he said quietly. But the old man shook his head firmly. "No, they don't. They're all greedy, ruthless. The only thing that matters to them is money." His voice rose with frustration. "And they're not even happy. All they care about is fortune. They want to be buried with their wealth. They hoard and then what?" His eyes drifted into the distance. I was never supposed to go back there. But now here I am. His voice trembled. Anger, sorrow, regret. They all flickered across his face at once. David had no idea what to say. He didn't know this man's life, but he could see the weight of a painful past in his words. Just then the door swung open. David instinctively turned his head, and saw a man standing breathless in the doorway. His eyes were wide with shock, his face pale. David's breath caught in his throat. He knew this man. All too well. Mr. Wagner. And the only word that escaped his lips was a stunned whisper. Dad? David's eyes darted between the old man and Wagner, his mind racing. Everything suddenly clicked into place. David's chest tightened. The man sitting before him, the one who had spoken with such bitterness about greed and ambition, was Wagner's father. And Mr. Wagner, the man who had insulted him, humiliated him, fired him over a sandwich, was now staring in horror at the person who had just saved his father's life. Mr. Wagner, still out of breath, shifted his gaze from his father to David. His brows furrowed in confusion, his expression filled with disbelief, as if he couldn't trust his own eyes. In a hushed, bewildered voice he asked, "What are you doing here?" David's throat tightened. He had no idea what to say. He was about to respond when the old man cut in, his voice booming with anger. "This young man saved my life," he thundered. "My old mind failed me again. I don't remember how I left the house. A car hit me, I could have died." His voice echoed through the room. His hands trembled, his face a mix of frustration and deep gratitude. Mr. Wagner stood frozen. It was as if reality had just slapped him across the face. His father's words shattered the walls of arrogance and pride he had built around himself. He swallowed hard, and the shock in his face slowly gave way to something else, something resembling regret. And then, he turned to David. Guilt flickered in his eyes. His lips trembled. Only one word managed to escape his mouth. "I'm sorry." David looked at him. But he said nothing. Could an apology erase all the humiliation he had endured? The insults, the accusations, being called a liar, a thief over a sandwich? Wagner had nearly ruined his life. Was an apology supposed to make it all okay? David wasn't going to answer. Even as regret darkened Wagner's gaze, David remained silent. Finally he turned to the old man. Speaking from the heart, he said, "I should go now. Please take care of yourself, sir." He placed a gentle hand on the old man's shoulder. But just as he was about to leave, the old man lifted his hand, stopping him. "Wait," he called out. "Why are you the one forgiving?" David took a deep breath. He didn't want to drag this out. "It's all right, sir," his voice was soft but firm. "Take care of yourself." And without another word he walked out of the room. Behind him, a father and son stood frozen in the weight of their past, staring at each other in the silence. David sat in his kitchen early in the morning, staring blankly at his laptop screen. He had applied to countless job postings, but there had been no response. The bills piling up on the table in front of him were a constant reminder that time was running out. Sighing, he turned back to the application form. Just then there was a knock at the door. He stood up and opened it, only to find someone he never expected to see. Mr. Wagner. David was stunned. Wagner still carried his usual stiff posture, but this time, there was something different in his expression. A weight, something serious. Maybe even regret. "We need to talk," he said directly. David, still caught off guard, stepped aside and silently let him in. As Wagner entered, his gaze swept across the room. The pile of overdue bills, the open job postings on the laptop. He took a deep breath, then looked David straight in the eyes. "David," he started. "I owe you an apology. You don't have to accept it, I wouldn't blame you if you didn't. But I need to say it." David remained silent, waiting for him to continue. Wagner shifted uncomfortably. "You saved my father's life," he said. "And I remember how I treated you. Seeing you at the hospital shocked me." His eyes drifted away. "It made me think about a lot of things." David frowned slightly, watching him closely. "I have so many regrets," Wagner admitted. "I realized my father doesn't have much time left. And He hesitated. The words weren't coming easily. "I've been living like I'll never die. Hurting people as if it doesn't matter." He exhaled sharply. "For so long." For a moment there was silence. Wagner's eyes were slightly glossy. But he quickly composed himself, clearing his throat and changing the subject. "Anyway," he said, his voice firm again, "I know you'd never agree to work for me again. And there's no job left for you anyway." David lifted his head slightly. "What do you mean?" he asked, confused. Wagner let out a short chuckle. I'm quitting. David's eyebrows shot up. You're quitting? Yes. Wagner nodded. My father wants to move to the countryside, live peacefully. And I realized, I need this too. To remember who I am. David stared at him in disbelief. This was the same man who had insulted him over a sandwich, the man consumed by greed. And yet, now he looked like someone who had truly changed. Wagner smirked slightly. I'm handing the business over to my nephew. Trust me, you wouldn't want to work for him either. He's a nightmare. David let out a small chuckle, unsure if Wagner was joking or not. Wagner took a step back, heading toward the door. For my father. And for myself, thank you again, David. David didn't know what to say. He simply nodded. And then Mr. Wagner opened the door and walked out. David sat back down, still trying to process everything. Had that really just happened? For the first time, he had seen genuine gratitude in Wagner's eyes. Was it real? Should he believe it? Just then his phone rang. He glanced at the screen. Unknown number. Hesitantly he answered. Hello, this is Live Medical, a kind female voice said. I see you've applied for an ambulance driver position. Mr. Wagner gave you a reference. We'd love to have you if you're still interested. David was speechless. Wagner had given him a reference? Just as he was about to call and thank him, his phone rang again. This time it was from his bank. His mortgage. David's heart clenched. Had he fallen behind on payments? Hurriedly he answered. Mr. David, we're calling to inform you that your home loan has been fully paid off. The representative's voice was calm. Just a courtesy update. David's breath hitched. How was that possible? And then he understood. This was Wagner's silent apology. Knowing David would never accept it, he had repaid his debt without saying a word. As David put the phone down, he closed his eyes and leaned back in his chair. His life had changed in a single day. One moment of human kindness had changed Wagner too. He picked up his phone to call Wagner. But it went straight to voicemail. I'm at the farm with my father. I'm retired. Don't call. David hung up and smiled. Wagner was truly gone. And just like that, a new chapter had begun. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the like button. Subscribe to our channel for more exciting content. Support us with a super like to help bring more stories to life. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. Thank you. See you in the next story.